On a Tuesday morning in 2024, workers were tearing down an old beach house in Coral Bay, Florida. Under the concrete basement floor, they found two buried suitcases. The suitcases belonged to Mallory and Phoenix Ravenscroft, the couple who vanished from their beach rental in 1997. Inside was a journal with an entry dated 3 days after they disappeared. The entry said they found a deadly secret that someone killed them for. For 27 years, everyone thought they were missing. Now the truth was clear: they were murdered. What secret did they discover? And who killed them to keep it buried? Detective Brianna Foxworth stood in the dusty basement of what used to be 214 Seashell Drive. The old beach house was nothing but broken walls and rubble now. Construction workers had been tearing it down all morning to make room for a fancy new resort. She never expected to be called to a demolition site on a Tuesday morning in March, but here she was, staring at something that made her heart pound like thunder in her chest. "Ma'am, you need to see this," Tommy, the construction worker, had said when he called the police station an hour ago. His voice was shaking. "We found something real strange under the concrete floor." Now Brianna understood why Tommy sounded so scared. Two old suitcases sat in the dirt where the basement floor used to be. They were the kind people used in the old days, brown leather with metal corners. Someone had buried them under thick concrete, like they never wanted them to be found. But that wasn't the strangest part. Brianna knelt down and opened the first suitcase with her gloved hands. Inside were clothes that looked like they came from the 1990s. A yellow sundress, a blue button-up shirt, sandals that still had sand between the straps. Her breath caught when she saw the name tags sewn inside the clothes: M. Ravenscroft and P. Ravenscroft, Mallory and Phoenix Ravenscroft. The couple who vanished from their beach rental 27 years ago. The couple the whole town still talked about. The couple whose disappearance had never been solved. "This can't be right," Brianna whispered to herself. She opened the second suitcase with trembling fingers. More clothes, 2 passports, a wedding ring with tiny diamonds that caught the light, and something that made her stomach drop: a journal with a faded blue cover. Brianna carefully opened the journal. The pages were yellow with age, but the writing was still clear. She flipped to the last entry and felt the world spin around her. The date at the top of the page was July 5th. But everyone in Coral Bay knew that Mallory and Phoenix Ravenscroft had disappeared on July. This entry was written 3 days after they vanished. Brianna read the words written in neat handwriting. Phoenix was right. We should never have trusted him. Now it's too late. If anyone finds this, know that we tried to do the right thing. But some secrets are worth killing for. The water here is poison, and people are dying because of it. We found proof, but they found us first. I don't know if we'll make it through the night. If something happens to us, look for the truth under the lighthouse. The companies think they can bury this forever, but the ocean always gives up its secrets eventually. Brianna's hands shook as she read the entry again. Everyone in town thought Mallory and Phoenix were victims. Sweet young newlyweds who got lost or hurt somehow. Maybe they had an accident. Maybe they ran away together. But this journal told a different story. Detective Foxworth. Tommy, the construction worker, was standing at the top of the basement stairs. "Should we stop work for the day?" Brianna looked around the broken basement. Whoever buried these suitcases had worked hard to hide them. The concrete had been thick, professional, like someone knew exactly how to make sure they would never be found. But old beach houses don't last forever. And sometimes the truth has a way of coming back up, like shells washing up on the shore after a storm. "Yes, Tommy, stop all work," Brianna said, standing up. "This whole area is now a crime scene." She carefully closed the journal and placed it back in the suitcase. Her mind was racing. If Mallory had written this entry 3 days after their disappearance, then everything the town believed was wrong. Mallory and Phoenix hadn't just vanished into thin air. They hadn't run away to start a new life somewhere else. They hadn't had an accident while swimming or boating. Someone had killed them. Someone with secrets to hide. Someone who thought burying their belongings under concrete would make sure no one ever learned the truth. Brianna looked up at the grey sky through the broken roof. In a few hours, news trucks would be here. Reporters would want answers. The families would want to know what happened to their children. And Brianna would have to tell them that after 27 years of wondering, they finally had their answer. Mallory and Phoenix Ravenscroft weren't missing anymore. They were murder victims, and their killer was still out there. 27 years earlier, in the summer of 1997, Coral Bay was a sleepy beach town where everyone knew everyone else's business. That's why Mallory and Phoenix Ravenscroft caused such a stir when they arrived in June. They drove into town in a white rental car, looking like something out of a magazine. Mallory had long auburn hair that caught the sunlight like copper pennies. Her eyes were the color of sea glass, green and blue all mixed together. She wore simple sundresses and walked barefoot on the sand, collecting shells in a wicker basket. Phoenix was tall and handsome, with dark hair and a smile that made everyone want to be his friend. He had strong hands and kind eyes. When he laughed, which was often, the sound carried across the beach like music. Betty Hollowfield was the first person to meet them. She ran the bait and tackle shop on the main pier, and she had lived in Coral Bay her whole life. When the young couple walked into her shop that first day, she couldn't help but smile. "You two look like you're in love," Betty said, watching them hold hands as they looked at fishing supplies. Mallory blushed and leaned against Phoenix's shoulder. "We just got married 3 weeks ago," she said softly. "This is our honeymoon. We wanted somewhere quiet and beautiful." "Well, you found the right place," Betty said. "Coral Bay is the most peaceful spot on the coast. Perfect for newlyweds." Phoenix squeezed Mallory's hand. "My little mermaid loves the ocean," he said with a grin. "I think she'd live underwater if she could. And my sea captain would sail away with me if I asked him to," Mallory replied, looking up at him with those sea glass eyes. Betty felt her heart melt. In 30 years of running the shop, she had seen plenty of couples come and go. But these two were special. They looked at each other like they had found their missing piece. The couple rented a small blue cottage at 207 Seashell Drive from Mrs. Emberly Saltwater, an old widow who owned several rental properties. The cottage was simple but charming, with white shutters and a front porch that faced the ocean. Every morning, Mallory would wake up early and walk along the shore. She carried a notebook and stopped often to write things down or sketch pictures of shells and sea creatures. Sometimes she would wade into the shallow water and just stand there, watching the waves. Phoenix spent his mornings on the porch, reading thick books about law and environmental science. But he wasn't all work. In the afternoons he would help the local fishermen fix their nets or carry their heavy coolers. He never asked for money, just smiled and said he was happy to help. Sammy Thornwick was 16 that summer, and worked delivering groceries to the beach cottages. He looked forward to his visits to 2047 Seashell Drive because Phoenix always tipped him well and Mallory always offered him cold lemonade. "They're like people from a fairy tale," Sammy told his friends. "They hold hands everywhere they go. I saw them dancing on the beach last night when I was riding my bike home." The whole town fell in love with the perfect couple. At the grocery store they would buy flowers for their cottage and ingredients for romantic dinners. At the ice cream shop they shared strawberry cones and fed each other bites while sitting on the wooden benches outside. Phoenix called Mallory "my little mermaid" because of how much she loved the water. Mallory called Phoenix "my sea captain" because he was always looking out at the horizon like he was planning their next adventure. They seemed to exist in their own magical world where nothing could go wrong. But if you looked closely, really closely, you might have noticed small things that didn't quite fit the perfect picture. Sometimes Phoenix would stare at the ocean with an expression that was too serious for a man on his honeymoon. His eyes would get hard and distant, like he was thinking about something troubling. Sometimes Mallory would stop writing in her notebook and look around nervously, as if she was worried someone might be watching her. When this happened, she would close the notebook quickly and walk back to the cottage. Late at night, after the town was asleep, people walking their dogs on the beach would sometimes see the couple having quiet conversations by the water's edge. They would stop talking whenever anyone came too close, and their voices always sounded more serious than you would expect from newlyweds. Dr. Adelaide Nightingale lived in a cottage a mile up the coast. She was a retired marine biologist who spent her days studying the local sea life. One morning she found Mallory sitting on the rocks near her house, staring at something in the tide pools. "The fish look sick," Mallory said when Dr. Nightingale approached. "Have you noticed that too?" Dr. Nightingale looked where Mallory was pointing. It was true, some of the small fish in the shallow water did seem sluggish and discolored. But she had assumed it was just the normal cycle of ocean life. "I study marine biology," Mallory explained. "I just finished graduate school. These fish, they look like they've been exposed to something harmful." Dr. Nightingale was surprised. The young woman seemed to know more about sea life than most people. But before she could ask more questions, Phoenix appeared on the beach. "There you are, my little mermaid," he called out, but his voice sounded strained. "Ready for breakfast?" Mallory jumped up quickly, almost like she had been caught doing something wrong. She smiled at Dr. Nightingale and hurried away with her husband. But Dr. Nightingale noticed that as they walked back toward their cottage, they weren't holding hands like usual, and their heads were bent together in serious conversation, the kind that looked more like an argument than romantic pillow talk. Still, everyone in Coral Bay continued to see them as the perfect couple. They were young, beautiful, and so clearly in love. What could possibly be wrong with their fairy tale romance? None of them could have imagined that in just a few weeks, Mallory and Phoenix Ravenscroft would vanish without a trace, leaving behind only questions and a mystery that would haunt the town for the next 27 years. During their final week in Coral Bay, something changed about Mallory and Phoenix. The townspeople noticed it, but nobody wanted to believe that the perfect couple might be having problems. It started with Phoenix's shopping trips to Betty Hollowfield's bait shop. Instead of buying normal fishing supplies, he began asking for strange things. "I need heavy rope," he told Betty on a Tuesday morning. "The kind that won't break underwater." Betty raised her eyebrows. "Planning to catch a whale?" she joked. Phoenix didn't laugh. "Something like that," he said quietly. The next day, he came back asking for waterproof containers and diving weights. Betty had been selling fishing supplies for 30 years, and she knew these weren't things you used for regular fishing. "Phoenix, honey, what are you really planning to do with all this stuff?" she asked. Phoenix's charming smile flickered for just a second. "Mallory and I want to try some deep water fishing before we leave. You know how much she loves the ocean." But Betty wasn't convinced. The rope he bought was strong enough to anchor a boat in a storm. The waterproof containers looked like the kind people used to hide valuable things underwater. And why would a couple on their honeymoon need so many diving weights? Meanwhile, Mallory was spending hours at the small public library in town. Mrs. Coral Seaworth, the librarian, noticed that the young woman always sat at the same table in the back corner, surrounded by old newspapers and marine science books. "She's researching something," Mrs. Seaworth told her husband over dinner, "but she won't tell me what. Every time I ask if she needs help, she just smiles and says she's working on a personal project." What Mrs. Seaworth didn't know was that Mallory was reading everything she could find about local water pollution, fishing industry records, and something called the Prosperity, a ship that had sunk near Coral Bay 35 years earlier. Dr. Adelaide Nightingale began seeing more of Mallory during those final days. The young woman would appear at her cottage every morning, always with her notebook and always with questions. "Dr. Nightingale," Mallory said one morning, "what would you do if you discovered something terrible that could hurt innocent people, but telling the truth might put you in danger?" Adelaide was surprised by the serious question. "That's a heavy thing to think about during your honeymoon, dear." Mallory stared out at the ocean. "I mean, what if someone was poisoning the water and you had proof, but the people doing it were very powerful?" "I suppose I'd have to find a way to expose the truth safely," Adelaide replied. "But why are you asking me this?" Mallory's eyes filled with tears, but she wiped them away quickly. "Just wondering. Sometimes doing the right thing is harder than people think." The conversations always ended the same way. Phoenix would appear on the beach calling for his little mermaid, and Mallory would hurry away. But Adelaide noticed that their romantic nicknames were starting to sound forced, like they were putting on a show. By their last week, even Sammy Thornwick could tell something was wrong. When he delivered groceries to their cottage, he could hear raised voices through the windows. "We have to tell someone," he heard Mallory say one afternoon. "It's too dangerous," Phoenix replied. "You don't understand how powerful these people are. But people are getting sick. The fish are dying. We can't just ignore it." "We're not ignoring it, we're being careful. If we move too fast, we'll end up like the others." Sammy didn't understand what they were talking about, but he could hear the fear in their voices. These weren't the happy newlyweds he had met a few weeks ago. These were two people who were terrified of something. The tension came to a head on their second-to-last day in town. Letty Hollowfield was closing up her shop when she saw Mallory and Phoenix on the beach, having what looked like a serious argument. Mallory was crying, her hands moving wildly as she talked. Phoenix kept looking around nervously, like he was worried someone might be watching them. Their voices were too low for Betty to hear the words, but their body language told the story. This wasn't a lover's quarrel. This was two people trying to make a life-or-death decision. The argument ended when Phoenix took Mallory's hands and pulled her close. He said something in her ear that made her nod through her tears. They stood there for a long moment holding each other tight, like they were saying goodbye. That evening, something even stranger happened. Cormac Blackthorne came to town. Cormac was a businessman from up north who owned several properties in Coral Bay, but he rarely visited. He was a tall, thin man with silver hair and expensive suits that looked out of place in the beach town. Sammy saw Cormac talking to Phoenix outside the ice cream shop. The conversation lasted about 20 minutes, and both men looked very serious. Phoenix kept shaking his head, but Cormac kept talking, like he was trying to convince him of something. Later that night, Sammy saw Cormac talking to Mallory near the pier. This conversation was shorter, but Mallory looked scared when it was over. She ran back to the cottage, and Cormac drove away in his black car. The next morning was July 12, 1997. It would be the last day anyone in Coral Bay would see Mallory and Phoenix Ravenscroft alive. Mrs. Emberly Saltwater, their landlady, knocked on their cottage door around noon to ask about checkout procedures. No one answered. She used her key to peek inside and found the cottage empty. But here was the strange part. All of their belongings were still there. Mallory's shell collection sat on the windowsill. Phoenix's law books were stacked neatly on the table. Their clothes were folded in the dresser drawers. Even their toothbrushes were still in the bathroom. The only thing missing was their rental car. Mrs. Saltwater assumed they had gone for a drive and would be back soon. But as the hours passed and they didn't return, she began to worry. By evening, she called the police. By the next morning, the perfect couple had become Coral Bay's greatest mystery. And somewhere in town, someone who knew exactly what had happened to them was probably sleeping peacefully, thinking their secret would stay buried forever. They were wrong. Sheriff Dutch Greyhaven had been keeping the peace in Coral Bay for 15 years. He was Betty Hollowfield's younger brother, a steady man with grey hair and kind eyes, who knew every family in town. But he had never dealt with anything like this before. When Mrs. Emberly Saltwater called about her missing renters, Dutch thought it would be simple. Young couples sometimes had fights and took off for a day or two. They always came back, but this felt different from the start. Dutch drove to 257 Seashell Drive on the morning of July 13th. He walked through the cottage slowly, taking notes. Everything looked normal. Too normal. The bed was made perfectly. Dishes were washed and put away. Mallory's sundresses hung neatly in the closet. Phoenix's shaving kit sat by the bathroom sink like he was planning to use it that evening. People don't leave for vacation and make their beds this neat, Dutch muttered to himself. He found Mallory's purse on the kitchen counter. Her wallet was inside with $63 and her driver's license. Her wedding ring was in a small dish by the sink, like she had taken it off to wash dishes and forgotten to put it back on. But Phoenix's wallet was nowhere to be found. Dutch called the rental car company. The white sedan was supposed to be returned that afternoon, but Phoenix had never showed up. Dutch put out a bulletin to other police departments, asking them to watch for the car. The call came 3 days later from a police officer in Gainesville, 2,000 miles inland. "We found your rental car," the officer said, "parked at a shopping center. Keys were still in the ignition." Dutch drove to Gainesville immediately. The car was clean, too clean, like someone had wiped it down carefully before leaving it. The gas tank was nearly empty, but there was no sign of where Phoenix and Mallory had gone from there. Back in Coral Bay, the news was spreading fast. Betty Hollowfield told everyone who came into her shop. Dr. Adelaide Nightingale called her friends. Sammy Thornwick told his parents, who told their neighbors. By the end of the week, reporters were calling from Jacksonville and Miami. The story was perfect for newspapers. Young couple vanishes during honeymoon in paradise. Dutch tried to piece together their last day. Mrs. Emberly Saltwater said she saw them having breakfast on their porch around 8 in the morning. They looked normal, she said. Maybe a little quiet, but not upset. Sammy Thornwick delivered groceries to their cottage around 10 o'clock. He remembered that Phoenix tipped him $5, which was more than usual. Mallory had given him a glass of fresh orange juice and asked him about his plans for college. She seemed sad, Sammy told Dutch, like she was saying goodbye or something. Dr. Adelaide Nightingale was the last person to see Mallory. Around 11:30, she spotted the young woman walking alone on the beach near her cottage. I waved, but she didn't wave back, Adelaide told Dutch. She was staring at the water like she was looking for something, or maybe like she was trying to memorize it. After that, nothing. It was like Mallory and Phoenix had simply walked into the ocean and disappeared. Phoenix's family arrived from Boston 2 days later. His father, William Ravenscroft, was a rich businessman who wore expensive suits and talked fast. His mother, Patricia, cried constantly and kept asking the same questions over and over. Phoenix would never just leave, Patricia told Dutch. He calls me every Sunday. He's never missed a call in his whole life. William Ravenscroft hired 2 private investigators and offered a $10,000 reward for information. He also called people he knew in the state government, demanding that more resources be put into finding his son. Mallory's parents, James and Ruth Kellerman, drove down from Iowa in their old pickup truck. They were simple farming people who seemed overwhelmed by all the attention. James was quiet and worried. Ruth cried as much as Patricia Ravenscroft, but in a different way, like she was already mourning. Mallory was always careful, Ruth told Dutch. She wouldn't take risks. She wouldn't go swimming alone or get in a car with strangers. Something bad happened to our little girl. Dutch felt the pressure from all sides. The families wanted answers. The reporters wanted a story. The mayor wanted the whole thing to go away because it was bad for tourism. But the more Dutch investigated, the more confused he became. A young reporter named Sage Moonbeam came down from the Jacksonville newspaper. She was smart and asked good questions. While other reporters focused on the romantic angle of the missing honeymooners, Sage dug deeper. "Sheriff, did you know that Phoenix Ravenscroft was asking questions about an old shipwreck?" she asked Dutch one afternoon. Dutch was surprised. "What shipwreck?" "Something called the Prosperity. It sank off the coast here in 1962. I found 3 different people who remember Phoenix asking about it." Dutch had lived in Coral Bay his whole life, but he had never heard of the Prosperity. He asked some of the older fishermen, and they remembered the ship, but didn't know much about it. "It went down in a storm," said Captain Joe Harwick, who had been fishing these waters for 40 years. Coast Guard said it was carrying cargo, but they never said what kind. Always seemed strange to me that they sealed up all the records about it. Sage Moonbeam kept digging. She discovered that Phoenix had visited the county clerk's office and the Historical Society, asking for information about the shipwreck. He had also requested copies of old Coast Guard reports, but most of the files were classified or missing. Why would a man on his honeymoon care about a 35-year-old shipwreck? Sage asked. Dutch didn't have an answer. But he was starting to think that Mallory and Phoenix's disappearance wasn't as simple as a young couple getting lost or having an accident. Dr. Adelaide Nightingale came to see Dutch a week after the couple vanished. She looked troubled. "Sheriff, I keep thinking about my conversations with Mallory," she said. "She asked me strange questions about what someone should do if they discovered something dangerous." "What kind of dangerous?" Dutch asked. She said, "What if someone was poisoning the water and you had proof, but the people doing it were very powerful?" I thought she was just talking in general terms, but now I wonder if she actually knew something. Dutch felt a chill run down his spine. What if Mallory and Phoenix hadn't just disappeared? What if they had been silenced? 3 weeks after the disappearance, Dutch got a call that made everything even more mysterious. "Sheriff Greyhaven? This is Mrs. Saltwater. Someone paid next month's rent on the cottage. In cash." Dutch drove to Mrs. Saltwater's house immediately. She handed him an envelope with enough money to cover another month's rent for 237 Seashell Drive. There was a note inside, written in neat handwriting that Dutch didn't recognize. The note said, "Please hold the cottage for M&P Ravenscroft. They may return sooner than expected." The handwriting didn't match the samples Dutch had of Mallory and Phoenix's writing. Someone else had written this note. Someone who knew where they were, or someone who wanted people to think they were still alive. Dutch stared at the note for a long time. After 3 weeks of investigation, he was more confused than ever. But one thing was becoming clear. Whatever happened to Mallory and Phoenix Ravenscroft wasn't random. Someone had planned this carefully, and that someone was still out there, watching and waiting to see if their plan would work. Sheriff Dutch Greyhaven couldn't sleep. 3 weeks had passed since Mallory and Phoenix disappeared, and every new clue made the mystery deeper instead of clearer. The note about holding the cottage bothered him most of all. Someone was playing games with his investigation. He decided to find out more about the Prosperity. Dutch drove to the state capitol in Tallahassee, using connections from his days in the military. William Ravenscroft's pressure on state officials had opened some doors that were usually locked tight. At the Coast Guard headquarters, Dutch met with Captain Maria Santos, a serious woman with grey hair who had worked with government records for 20 years. "The Prosperity case is unusual," Captain Santos told him, pulling out a thick file marked classified. "Most shipwreck records are public after 30 years. But this one is still sealed." Dutch leaned forward. "Why?" "Because of what the ship was carrying," Captain Santos said quietly. "It wasn't just any cargo vessel. The Prosperity was illegally dumping chemical waste for several major companies." Dutch felt his stomach drop. "Chemical waste?" Captain Santos nodded. "Toxic chemicals from manufacturing plants. Back in 1962, companies couldn't legally dump this stuff anywhere, so they hired ships to take it far out to sea and dump it illegally. The Prosperity was caught in a storm before it could reach the deep water dumping site. So it sank close to shore, about 2 miles off Coral Bay. All that chemical waste went straight to the bottom, right in your fishing waters." Dutch's hands were shaking. "Captain Santos, people in my town have been fishing and swimming in that water for 35 years. "I know," she said sadly. "The companies involved covered it up. They paid off officials, sealed the records, and pretended it never happened. A few people tried to investigate over the years, but they were either bought off, or what?" Captain Santos looked around nervously. "Or they had accidents, car crashes, fishing boat accidents, heart attacks. Always something that looked natural." Dutch drove back to Coral Bay with his mind racing. If Mallory and Phoenix had discovered the truth about the Prosperity, they would have known that several major companies had been poisoning his town for decades. That was definitely worth killing for. Back home, Dutch started looking at the case differently. He reviewed all of Mallory's conversations with Dr. Adelaide Nightingale. Her questions about water poisoning and powerful people suddenly made perfect sense. He also looked more carefully at Phoenix's background. The young man wasn't just any environmental lawyer. Dutch made some phone calls and discovered that Phoenix had worked on several major cases involving corporate pollution. He specialized in cases where companies tried to cover up environmental damage. Dutch felt sick. Mallory and Phoenix hadn't come to Coral Bay for a honeymoon. They had come to investigate the Prosperity. But who had sent them? And how had their investigation been discovered? Dutch decided to take a closer look at the mysterious businessman Cormac Blackthorne. He drove to the county clerk's office and researched Cormac's property holdings. What he found made his blood run cold. Cormac Blackthorne owned not just several properties in Coral Bay, but also had business connections to 3 of the companies that had been using the Prosperity to dump chemicals in 1962. One of those companies was still operating under a different name. Dutch realized that Cormac had probably been watching Mallory and Phoenix from the moment they arrived in town. When he discovered what they were really doing, he had to stop them. But Dutch needed proof. He couldn't accuse a powerful businessman of murder based on suspicion alone. He decided to search the cottage at 27 Seashell Drive one more time. This time, he looked for things he might have missed during his first investigation. In the bedroom closet, behind Mallory's dresses, Dutch found something strange. Someone had carved a small hole in the back wall of the closet. The hole was just big enough to fit a small object. Dutch shined his flashlight into the hole and saw something metallic. Using tweezers, he carefully pulled out a small key attached to a piece of paper. The paper had an address written in Mallory's handwriting, Locker 24/7, Greyhound Station, Gainesville. Dutch's heart pounded. Gainesville was where their rental car had been found. Mallory and Phoenix had hidden something there. Dutch drove to Gainesville immediately. At the bus station, he used the key to open Locker 247. Inside was a waterproof bag containing documents, photographs, and water samples. The documents were scientific reports showing that the water around Coral Bay contained dangerous levels of chemical contamination. The photographs showed dead fish, discolored water, and sick marine life. The water samples had labels with dates and locations, but the most shocking item was a letter addressed to whoever finds this. The letter was written in both Mallory and Phoenix's handwriting. If you are reading this, then something has happened to us. We are federal agents sent to investigate environmental crimes in Coral Bay. My real name is Mallory Chen, EPA investigator. My husband's real name is Phoenix Rodriguez, FBI Environmental Crimes Division. Dutch read the letter 3 times before it sank in. The young couple everyone thought were innocent honeymooners were actually federal agents working undercover. The letter continued, "We discovered that several companies have been illegally dumping toxic waste in Coral Bay waters since 1962. The shipwreck called the Prosperity was just the beginning. They've been using local businesses as fronts for ongoing dumping operations. We collected enough evidence to shut down the operation and send people to prison. But someone discovered our real identities. We've been getting threats. Someone broke into our cottage while we were out. We think our phones are tapped. If something happens to us, please give this evidence to Agent Sarah Mitchell at the FBI field office in Jacksonville. She's the only person we trust. The contamination is making people sick. Fish populations are dying. Children who swim in the bay are developing health problems. The main person responsible is Cormac Blackthorne, but he's not working alone. Several local officials are being paid to look the other way. Some federal agents might be involved too. We don't know who we can trust. We've hidden additional evidence in 3 other locations. Check under the lighthouse, inside the old pier pilings, and beneath the floor of the abandoned bait shack on Pelican Point." The letter was signed by both agents and dated July 11, 1997, the day before they disappeared. Dutch sat in his truck outside the bus station staring at the evidence. Everything made sense now. Mallory and Phoenix weren't victims of a random crime. They were federal agents who had discovered a massive environmental conspiracy, and they had been murdered to keep them quiet. But the letter revealed something even more terrifying. If local officials were being paid off, then Dutch couldn't trust anyone in his own department. If federal agents were involved, he couldn't even trust the FBI. The young couple had died trying to save his town, and Dutch was probably the only person left who could finish what they started. But first, he had to figure out who he could trust. And he had to find those 3 other evidence hiding places before the killers found them. Because one thing was certain, if Cormac Blackthorne had killed 2 federal agents to protect his secret, he wouldn't hesitate to kill a small-town sheriff too. 27 years passed like waves washing over sand. Most of the people who remembered Mallory and Phoenix grew old or moved away. Sheriff Dutch Greyhaven died of a heart attack in 2014, taking his secrets with him. The case files gathered dust in the basement of the police station, but some secrets refused to stay buried. Detective Brianna Foxworth arrived in Coral Bay in January 20. She was 34 years old with short brown hair and determined eyes. She had requested the transfer from Miami because she needed a quieter place to work. Her own sister had disappeared 5 years earlier, and big city cases reminded her too much of her own unsolved mystery. Police Chief Robert Sandler handed her a box of old case files on her first day. "Cold cases," he said with a shrug. "Nobody expects you to solve them. Just review them if you get bored." The Ravenscroft file was thick and full of yellowed papers. Brianna read through it during her lunch breaks, fascinated by the story of the vanished honeymooners. But something bothered her about the investigation. Sheriff Greyhaven had been thorough, but his note stopped suddenly in August. It was like he had given up searching for answers. Brianna decided to interview people who were still alive from 1997. Betty Hollowfield was now 78 and walked with a cane, but her memory was sharp as a knife. "Those 2 were special," Betty said, sitting in her small apartment above what used to be her bait shop. But they weren't what they seemed. My brother Dutch figured that out before he died. What do you mean? Brianna asked. Betty's eyes grew sad. Dutch never told me the whole story, but he said Mallory and Phoenix died trying to help people. He said powerful folks killed them to keep secrets buried. Did he say what kind of secrets? Something about poison in the water. Dutch said companies had been hurting our town for years, and those two young people found proof. Brianna felt her pulse quicken. Environmental crime was one of her specialties in Miami. She found Dr. Adelaide Nightingale in a nursing home outside town. At 89, the retired scientist was frail but still mentally sharp. I never forgot what Mallory asked me, Adelaide said, her voice shaky but clear. She wanted to know what someone should do if they discovered pollution that was making people sick. Did she say who was doing the polluting? Adelaide nodded slowly. She mentioned a ship that sank long ago. The something, Prosperity. She said chemicals from that ship were still poisoning our waters. Brianna's investigation took a dramatic turn when environmental activists came to Coral Bay in March 2024. A group called Ocean Guardians had been pressuring coastal towns to test their water quality. They had received reports that fish populations around Coral Bay were unusually low. Dr. Jennifer Waverly led the Ocean Guardians team. She was a marine biologist specialized in pollution damage. When her team tested the water around Coral Bay, they found dangerous levels of chemicals that had been banned for decades. This contamination didn't happen recently, Dr. Waverly told Brianna. These chemicals have been in your water for many years, probably decades. Could they be coming from an old shipwreck? Brianna asked. Dr. Waverly's eyes widened. Absolutely. If a ship carrying industrial waste sank here, the chemicals could still be leaking into the water. The Ocean Guardians used special underwater equipment to search for the source of contamination. In April 2024, they found the wreck of the Prosperity, sitting in 60 feet of water just 2 miles from shore. The discovery made national news. Environmental experts called it one of the worst cases of illegal dumping ever found. The rusty ship was still leaking toxic chemicals that had been poisoning Coral Bay's waters for over 60 years. Brianna realized that Mallory and Phoenix must have discovered this same evidence in 1997. If they had tried to expose the truth, it would have cost several companies millions of dollars in cleanup and legal damages. That was definitely a motive for murder. She tracked down Sage Moonbeam, the reporter who had covered the original case. Sage was now a successful investigative journalist working for a major newspaper in Miami. I never forgot that story, Sage told Brianna over the phone. Something was wrong about the whole thing. I kept investigating for years after everyone else gave up. What did you find? Cormac Blackthorne wasn't just a businessman. He was connected to several companies that were dumping chemicals illegally in the 1960s and 1970s. I think he was hired to make sure nobody ever found out about the Prosperity. Sage had kept copies of all her research from 1997. She sent Brianna boxes of documents showing that Cormac Blackthorne had business relationships with 3 major chemical companies. One of those companies was still operating under a different name. I tried to interview Blackthorne back then, Sage said, but he disappeared right after the couple vanished. Nobody saw him in Coral Bay for months. Brianna felt pieces of the puzzle clicking together, but she needed more than 27-year-old evidence to solve the case. She decided to search Sheriff Greyhaven's personal belongings. Betty Hollowfield had kept some of her brother's things in her attic. Dutch was acting strange before he died, Betty told Brianna. He kept talking about making things right. He said he had to tell someone the truth about what really happened to those 2 kids. In Dutch's old desk, Brianna found something that made her hands shake. Hidden in a secret drawer was a sealed envelope with instructions written on the outside. Only open if new evidence is found in the Ravenscroft case. Inside the envelope was a letter in Dutch's handwriting. If someone is reading this, then the truth is finally coming out. I helped kill Mallory and Phoenix, but I didn't know what I was doing. Federal agents came to me in July 1997. They said Mallory and Phoenix were undercover agents who had discovered something dangerous. They said the couple needed to disappear for their own safety. They asked me to help stage their disappearance. I thought I was helping save their lives. The federal agents gave me specific instructions about how to make it look like the couple had vanished on their own. I helped move their car. I made sure the investigation wouldn't look too hard for answers. But the federal agents lied to me. They weren't trying to protect Mallory and Phoenix. They were working for the companies that wanted them dead. By the time I figured out what really happened, it was too late. The letter included details about where the real bodies were buried and evidence that several other accidents over the years were actually murders. Dutch had drawn a map showing a location in the coastal cliffs where he had hidden additional evidence that Mallory and Phoenix had given him before they died. Brianna followed the map and found a waterproof container wedged into a crack in the rocks. Inside were documents, photographs and water samples that provided undeniable proof of the environmental disaster and the conspiracy to cover it up. The evidence showed that companies had been illegally dumping chemicals in Coral Bay waters for decades. They had bribed local officials, threatened scientists, and killed anyone who tried to expose the truth. Mallory Chen and Phoenix Rodriguez had gathered enough evidence to shut down the entire operation. They had died as heroes, trying to save a town full of people they barely knew. But their sacrifice hadn't been in vain. 27 years later, their evidence would finally bring justice to Coral Bay. And the people who killed them were about to learn that some secrets can't stay buried forever. Detective Brianna Foxworth knew she had enough evidence to reopen the case. But she needed to move carefully. If corrupt federal agents were involved in the original murders, she couldn't trust just anyone with this information. She contacted Agent Sarah Mitchell at the FBI field office in Jacksonville, the same agent Mallory and Phoenix had mentioned in their letter. Agent Mitchell was now in her 60s and close to retirement, but she remembered the case clearly. "I wondered what happened to those two," Agent Mitchell said when Brianna called. "Mallory Chen and Phoenix Rodriguez were two of our best people. When they stopped reporting in, we assumed their cover had been blown and they had to run." "They didn't run," Brianna said quietly. "They were murdered." Agent Mitchell was silent for a long moment. "Can you prove it?" "I have their evidence. All of it." Agent Mitchell drove to Coral Bay that same day. When Brianna showed her Dutch Greyhaven's confession and the hidden evidence from the cliffs, the federal agent's face went pale. "This is bigger than we thought," Agent Mitchell said. "If local law enforcement was compromised, and if our own agents were involved, how do we know who to trust?" Brianna asked. "We don't, but we have to try." Meanwhile, the discovery of the Prosperity wreck was causing problems for powerful people. Environmental lawyers were filing lawsuits. Government agencies were demanding investigations. Stock prices were falling for companies connected to the illegal dumping. Cormac Blackthorne, now 82 years old, still lived in a mansion outside Coral Bay. He had stayed out of the public eye for decades, but the new investigation was making him nervous. Brianna decided to visit him before the federal agents took over the case. She wanted to look him in the eyes and see if he would admit what he had done. Blackthorne's house sat on a hill overlooking the ocean. It was surrounded by high walls and security cameras. When Brianna rang the doorbell, a young man in a suit answered. "Mr. Blackthorne doesn't give interviews," the man said. "Tell him I'm here about Mallory Chen and Phoenix Rodriguez," Brianna replied. 5 minutes later, she was sitting across from Cormac Blackthorne in his expensive living room. He was thin and pale, with white hair and cold blue eyes. Despite his age, he still looked dangerous. "I don't know anyone by those names," Blackthorne said calmly. "You knew them as Mallory and Phoenix Ravenscroft, the honeymooners who disappeared in—" Blackthorne's expression didn't change. "Terrible tragedy. I felt sorry for their families." Brianna pulled out a photograph from the evidence Dutch had hidden. It showed Blackthorne talking to Phoenix outside the ice cream shop in. "This photo was taken the night before they disappeared," Brianna said. "What did you talk about?" For the first time, Blackthorne looked uncomfortable. "I don't remember. It was 27 years ago." "Let me help you remember. You offered to pay them to destroy their evidence about the prosperity. When they refused, you had them killed." Blackthorne stood up slowly. "Detective, you're making very serious accusations without proof." "I have plenty of proof. Water samples showing decades of illegal dumping, documents proving your companies were responsible, and a confession from Sheriff Greyhaven explaining how you tricked him into helping you murder 2 federal agents." Blackthorne's calm mask finally slipped. His eyes filled with anger, and his voice became sharp. "Those 2 were going to destroy everything," he snapped. "Do you have any idea how many jobs would have been lost? How many families would have suffered if they had exposed our operation?" "So you admit it?" Blackthorne realized his mistake immediately. He sat back down and tried to look calm again. "I admit nothing. You have no real evidence, just the fantasies of a dead sheriff and some old documents that prove nothing." But Brianna had recorded the entire conversation on her phone. Blackthorne's angry outburst was all the confession she needed. "Mr. Blackthorne, you're under arrest for the murders of Mallory Chen and Phoenix Rodriguez." The old man laughed bitterly. "You think this ends with me? I was just following orders. The people I worked for have power you can't imagine. They've been covering this up for 60 years, and they won't let one small-town detective ruin everything now." As Brianna handcuffed him, Blackthorne kept talking. "Those 2 agents thought they were so smart. They thought they could save your pathetic little town, but they never understood that some secrets are more important than a few sick fish and some contaminated water. Tell that to the families who have been drinking poisoned water for decades," Brianna replied. "The families don't matter," Blackthorne shouted. "The only thing that matters is protecting the people who keep this country running. The corporations. The real leaders. Not some tree-hugging agents who cared more about fish than business." Brianna felt sick listening to him. This man had ordered the deaths of 2 young people who were trying to protect innocent families, and he felt no guilt at all. But Blackthorne's arrest was just the beginning. Over the next few days, FBI agents raided offices in 3 states. They arrested corporate executives, corrupt government officials, and the federal agents who had helped cover up the murders. The investigation revealed that the conspiracy had been operating for over 60 years. Dozens of companies had used ships like the Prosperity to dump illegal chemicals in coastal waters. When environmental agents got too close to the truth, they were transferred, fired, or worse. Mallory Chen and Phoenix Rodriguez weren't the only agents who had died protecting the environment. The investigation uncovered evidence of at least 8 other suspicious deaths over the decades. But the most shocking discovery came when workers demolished the old Blackthorne property to search for more evidence. In the basement of his mansion, they found something that made Detective Foxworth's blood run cold. 2 perfectly preserved suitcases, buried under concrete, containing clothes and personal belongings that had been missing for 27 years. And inside one suitcase was Mallory's journal, with entries that revealed the final, terrifying truth about what had really happened during those last days in July. The entries showed that Mallory and Phoenix had tried to fake their own deaths to escape the conspiracy. But someone they trusted had betrayed them at the last moment. Someone who had promised to help them disappear safely but who had actually led them straight into a trap. The final entry, written in a shaking hand, revealed the name of their betrayer, and it was someone no one had suspected. Someone who had been living with the secret for 27 years, watching as their families suffered, knowing exactly what had happened but never saying a word. Detective Brianna Foxworth's hands trembled as she read the final entry in Mallory's journal. The handwriting was shaky and desperate, written by someone who knew death was coming. July 14, 1997, 11:30 p.m., Phoenix, and I thought we were so smart. We thought we had figured out how to escape safely. Dr. Nightingale promised to help us fake our deaths and get away from Coral Bay before Blackthorn's people could find us. She said she knew about boats and ocean currents. She said she could make it look like we drowned while swimming at night. She had diving equipment and everything planned, but something went wrong. When we met her at the hidden cove, like she said, there were men waiting for us, men with guns. Dr. Nightingale was crying. She kept saying, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry." She said they threatened to hurt her grandchildren if she didn't help them. I understand why she did it. But now Phoenix and I are going to die, and our evidence will never reach the FBI. The people of Coral Bay will keep drinking poisoned water, and no one will ever know the truth. If someone finds this journal, please know that Dr. Adelaide Nightingale is not evil. She was forced to betray us. But please also know that we tried so hard to save everyone. Phoenix says he loves me. I love him too. At least we'll die together. The ocean is calling us home. Brianna felt sick reading the words. Dr. Adelaide Nightingale, the sweet old lady in the nursing home who had seemed so fond of Mallory, the respected scientist who had helped with the recent investigation. She was the one who had led them to their deaths. Brianna drove to the Sunset Manor nursing home immediately. She found Dr. Nightingale in her wheelchair by the window, staring out at the ocean just like she did every day. At 89, Adelaide was frail and small. Her white hair was thin, and her hands shook with age. She looked like someone's grandmother, not a person who could help murder two young federal agents. "Hello, Mallory," Adelaide said softly when Brianna sat down beside her. Brianna was confused for a moment. Then she realized that Adelaide's mind was sometimes unclear. The old woman thought she was talking to Mallory. "Dr. Nightingale, I need to ask you about July." Adelaide's eyes became sharp and focused. She looked directly at Brianna. "You found the journal," she said simply. "Yes." Adelaide closed her eyes and took a shaky breath. "I've been waiting 27 years for someone to find it. Every single day, I've looked out at that ocean and thought about what I did to those beautiful children. Tell me what happened." Adelaide was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "They came to me on July 13th. Two men in expensive suits. They knew about my grandchildren in California. They knew where they lived, where they went to school, what time they walked home each day." Tears started rolling down the old woman's cheeks. "They showed me photographs of my granddaughter Emma playing in her front yard. She was only 8 years old. They said if I didn't help them, something terrible would happen to her and her little brother." Brianna felt her own eyes filling with tears. "What did they want you to do?" "They knew that Mallory trusted me. They wanted me to convince her and Phoenix to meet me at Hidden Cove. They said they just wanted to talk to them, to make a deal. But you knew it wasn't true." Adelaide nodded, sobbing now. "I knew they were going to kill them, but I couldn't let them hurt my grandchildren. Emma and Tommy were all I had left after my husband died. So you called Mallory." "I told her that I had discovered a safe way for them to disappear. I said I knew about secret caves where they could hide until a boat came to take them away from Florida. I made it sound like an adventure." Adelaide's voice broke completely. "They were so happy when I called. Mallory said, 'Dr. Nightingale, you're our guardian angel.' Phoenix said, We'll never forget how you saved our lives." Brianna had to look away. The betrayal was even worse because Mallory and Phoenix had trusted Adelaide completely. What happened at the cove? The men were waiting in the trees. When Mallory and Phoenix arrived, they came out with guns. The young people tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The cove is surrounded by cliffs. Adelaide was crying so hard she could barely speak. Mallory looked at me with those beautiful green eyes, and she said, "Why?" I tried to explain about my grandchildren, but she just nodded like she understood. Even when she was about to die, she was thinking about protecting innocent people. Did they say anything else? Phoenix told Mallory he loved her. She said she loved him too. Then Phoenix looked at the men and said, "You can kill us, but you can't kill the truth forever. Someone will finish what we started." Adelaide wiped her eyes with a tissue. "They made me watch. They said if I ever told anyone what really happened, they would still hurt my grandchildren." How did they die? They shot them and weighted their bodies with diving equipment. Then they sank them in the deepest part of the cove. But first, they made the children write notes in their journals, trying to make it look like they had committed suicide. Brianna realized this explained the journal entries dated after their disappearance. They had been forced to write them before they died. "The men told me to go home and never speak of this again. They said they would be watching me for the rest of my life." Adelaide looked out at the ocean again. "Every day for 27 years I've wished I had been braver. I should have found another way to protect my grandchildren. I should have warned Mallory and Phoenix." "Dr. Nightingale, you were in an impossible situation. Anyone would have done the same thing to protect their family. But those two young people died because of me, and their families never knew what happened. I've lived with that guilt every single day." Brianna touched the old woman's hand gently. "Your grandchildren, are they safe now?" Adelaide nodded. "Emma is 35 now. She's a teacher with children of her own. Tommy is 33 and works as a doctor. They never knew their lives were in danger." "Dr. Nightingale, I need you to tell the FBI everything you just told me. It's the only way to make sure the people who forced you to do this are punished." Adelaide looked scared. "But what if they try to hurt my family now? The men who threatened you are all in jail or dead. Cormac Blackthorne has been arrested. The companies involved are being shut down. Your family is safe now." Adelaide was quiet for several minutes, staring at the ocean. Finally she spoke. "Will it help Mallory and Phoenix's families to know the truth?" "Yes, they've spent 27 years wondering what happened. They deserve to know their children died as heroes." Adelaide nodded slowly. "Then I'll tell them everything. It's time to stop being a coward." 3 days later, FBI divers found the bodies of Mallory Chen and Phoenix Rodriguez in the underwater cave at Hidden Cove, exactly where Adelaide said they would be. They were still wearing the diving equipment that had been used to sink them. The discovery made international news. 2 young federal agents had been murdered while trying to expose one of the worst environmental cover-ups in American history. But their deaths had not been in vain. The evidence they gathered was finally being used to clean up Coral Bay and punish the companies responsible. And Dr. Adelaide Nightingale, after carrying the terrible secret for 27 years, was finally able to tell the world that Mallory Chen and Phoenix Rodriguez had died as heroes, trying to save people they barely knew. The truth about Mallory Chen and Phoenix Rodriguez spread across the country like wildfire. News reporters came from every major city to cover the story of 2 young federal agents who died trying to expose corporate environmental crimes. Detective Brianna Foxworth stood on the courthouse steps in Jacksonville, watching as FBI agents led Cormac Blackthorne and 6 other men in handcuffs toward the building. After 27 years, justice was finally coming to Coral Bay. The trial lasted 3 months. Dr. Adelaide Nightingale testified from her wheelchair, telling the jury exactly what had happened at Hidden Cove in July 1997. She spoke in a clear, strong voice, no longer the frightened woman who had kept secrets for decades. "I failed those two beautiful young people," she said, looking directly at Mallory and Phoenix's families. "But I want everyone to know how brave they were. Even when they knew they were going to die, they were thinking about saving others." Mallory's parents, James and Ruth Kellerman, sat in the front row of the courtroom every day. They had aged greatly in 27 years, but their eyes were bright with determination. They wanted to hear every detail of what had happened to their daughter. Phoenix's parents, William and Patricia Ravenscroft, had died years earlier, still wondering what had happened to their son. But his sister Maria was there, crying quietly as she learned the truth about her brother's heroic sacrifice. Betty Hollowfield, now 79, testified about the supplies Phoenix had bought and the strange conversations she had overheard. She also spoke about her brother Dutch, explaining how the guilt of being tricked into helping the conspiracy had eaten away at him for years. "My brother was a good man who thought he was helping save 2 young lives," Betty said. "The real criminals used his kindness against him." Dutch spent his last years trying to make up for what he had unknowingly done wrong. Sage Moonbeam, the former reporter, presented evidence she had gathered over the decades. Her investigation had connected Blackthorn to 12 different companies that had been illegally dumping chemicals in coastal waters across the southeastern United States. This wasn't just about Coral Bay, Sage told the jury. This conspiracy poisoned communities from Florida to North Carolina. Mallory and Phoenix discovered the tip of a very large iceberg. The most powerful testimony came from current residents of Coral Bay. Dr. Jennifer Waverly from Ocean Guardians presented medical evidence showing that people who had lived in the town for decades had unusually high rates of certain cancers and respiratory problems. "The contamination from the Prosperity and ongoing illegal dumping has been making people sick for 60 years, Dr. Waverly explained. "Families have been drinking poisoned water and eating contaminated fish without knowing it." A fisherman named Captain Joe Harwick, now in his 70s, testified about the mysterious fish deaths he had witnessed over the years. "I always wondered why certain areas of the bay never had fish," he said. "Now I know it was because nothing could survive in that poisoned water." Young mothers from Coral Bay talked about their children's health problems. Teachers spoke about students who seemed to get sick more often than normal. Elderly residents described family members who had died of rare cancers. The evidence was overwhelming. The conspiracy had not just murdered 2 federal agents, it had been slowly poisoning an entire community for decades. Cormac Blackthorn's defense lawyers tried to argue that he was just following orders from his corporate bosses. But the jury saw through this excuse. Phone records showed that Blackthorn had been making decisions about covering up environmental crimes for over 40 years. Mr. Blackthorn was not a victim, the prosecutor said during closing arguments. He was the architect of a criminal conspiracy that destroyed lives and communities for profit. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned to the courtroom, their faces were grim. "Guilty," the foreman said when asked about the murder charges. "Guilty on all counts." Cormac Blackthorn showed no emotion as the verdict was read, but when the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, his shoulders sagged. At 82 years old, he would spend his remaining years behind bars. 5 other corporate executives received sentences ranging from 25 years to life. 2 corrupt federal agents were sentenced to 30 years each. The conspiracy that had lasted 60 years was finally destroyed, but the victory was bittersweet. No amount of justice could bring back Mallory and Phoenix or undo the decades of illness and environmental damage. Outside the courthouse after the sentencing, Mallory's mother, Ruth, spoke to reporters with tears in her eyes. "My daughter and her husband died trying to protect people they didn't even know," she said. "I'm proud of them, but I wish they were here to see that their sacrifice meant something." Detective Foxworth announced that the FBI was creating a special task force to investigate similar environmental crimes across the country. She would head the task force, using the evidence that Mallory and Phoenix had died to collect. "This case has shown us that corporate environmental crimes are more common than we thought," Foxworth said. "We're going to make sure that other communities don't suffer the way Coral Bay has suffered." Betty Hollowfield decided to use some of the settlement money from the lawsuit to create a small museum in Mallory and Phoenix's memory. The museum would be housed in the renovated cottage at 227 Seashell Drive, the same place where they had lived during their final weeks. "People need to remember what those two young people did for our town," Betty said. "They gave up everything to try to save us." Dr. Adelaide Nightingale lived long enough to see the verdicts. She died peacefully 2 weeks after the trial ended, finally free of the terrible secret she had carried for so long. Her last words were an apology to Mallory and Phoenix, spoken to the ocean she had stared at every day for 27 years. The cleanup of Coral Bay began immediately. Environmental teams removed the wreckage of the Prosperity and contained the chemical contamination. For the first time in 60 years, the water around the town began to clear. Fish populations started returning within months. Dolphins were seen in the bay for the first time in decades. The beaches that had been lifeless for so long began to show signs of healthy marine life. Federal environmental agencies used Mallory and Phoenix's evidence to identify and clean up 14 other contaminated sites along the coast. The two agents had unknowingly started a chain reaction that would protect millions of people. Mallory Chen and Phoenix Rodriguez were posthumously awarded the Medal of Valor by the FBI and the Environmental Protection Agency's highest honor for civilian service. Their names were added to the memorial wall for federal agents who died in the line of duty. But the most meaningful tribute came from the people of Coral Bay themselves. Every year on July 14th, the anniversary of their deaths, the entire town gathered on the beach for a memorial service. Children brought flowers and released them into the now clean water. Families shared stories about the importance of protecting the environment, and everyone remembered two young people who had chosen to fight for truth and justice, even when they knew it might cost them everything. The memorial services always ended the same way. As the sun set over the clear blue waters of Coral Bay, everyone would stand in silence and look out at the ocean that had finally given up its secrets. And somewhere in that peaceful silence, it was easy to believe that Mallory Chen and Phoenix Rodriguez were finally at rest, knowing that their sacrifice had saved the town they died to protect. 5 years after the truth was revealed, Coral Bay had become a completely different place. Detective Brianna Foxworth stood on the pier where Betty Hollowfield's old bait shop used to be, watching children play in water that sparkled like diamonds in the morning sun. The transformation was amazing. The bay that had been lifeless for 60 years was now full of fish, dolphins, and sea turtles. Tourists came from all over the country, not just for the beautiful beaches, but to learn about environmental protection and the couple who had died fighting for clean water. Brianna had been promoted to head the FBI's Environmental Crimes Task Force. In 5 years, her team had solved 43 cases of illegal dumping and corporate cover-ups. Every time she caught another criminal, she thought about Mallory and Phoenix, knowing that their evidence had started it all. They would be so proud, she said to herself, watching a group of dolphins swim past the pier. Betty Hollowfield, now 84, walked slowly toward her using a cane. Despite her age, she still came to the Memorial Museum every day. The little blue cottage at 247 Seashell Drive had become one of the most visited historical sites in Florida. Another busy day at the museum, Betty said with a smile. 3 school groups came to learn about Mallory and Phoenix. The children always ask the same question. Were they really heroes? What do you tell them? Brianna asked. I tell them that heroes are just regular people who choose to do the right thing even when it's scary or dangerous. Those 2 young people could have walked away from what they discovered. Instead, they chose to fight for people they barely knew. Inside the museum, Betty had created displays showing Mallory and Phoenix's real identities as federal agents. Visitors could see copies of their environmental research, photographs of the contaminated water, and samples of the evidence they had collected. The bedroom where they had slept during their final weeks was preserved exactly as they had left it. Mallory's shell collection still sat on the windowsill. Phoenix's law books were stacked on the small table. Everything looked like they had just stepped out for a walk on the beach. But the most popular part of the museum was the Wall of Heroes, photographs and stories of other environmental agents who had died protecting communities from corporate pollution. Mallory and Phoenix's investigation had revealed that they were part of a much larger group of brave people. Dr. Jennifer Waverly from Ocean Guardians had established a marine research station on the other side of the bay. Every summer, college students came to study the recovering ecosystem and learn about the importance of environmental protection. This bay is a perfect example of how nature can heal when we stop poisoning it, Dr. Waverly often told her students. But it took the sacrifice of 2 young heroes to make that healing possible. The research station was officially named the Chen Rodriguez Marine Biology Center. Inside the building, a large photograph showed Mallory and Phoenix holding hands on the beach, smiling at something outside the frame. They looked so young and happy, like they had their whole lives ahead of them. Sammy Thornwick, now 43 and the mayor of Coral Bay, often brought his own children to visit the memorial. He remembered delivering groceries to the cottage and how kind Mallory and Phoenix had been to a shy teenager. They treated me like I mattered, Sammy told his kids. They always had time to talk and never made me feel unimportant. That's how I knew they were special people. The annual memorial service on July 14th had grown into a major event. Thousands of people came to Coral Bay to honor the memory of the 2 agents and learn about environmental protection. The service always began at the Cottage Museum and ended at the beach, where Mallory used to collect shells. This year, something special happened during the memorial. Mallory's nephew, David Kellerman, had become an environmental scientist inspired by his aunt's story. He was now 28 years old, the same age Mallory had been when she died. Mallory never got to see her research published or her environmental work continue, David said as he spoke to the crowd gathered on the beach. But her sacrifice inspired me and hundreds of other young scientists to carry on her mission. Phoenix's niece, Sarah Ravenscroft, had become an FBI agent specializing in environmental crimes. She worked directly with Detective Foxworth's task force, using her uncle's techniques to catch corporate criminals. Uncle Phoenix believed that the law should protect everyone, not just powerful companies, Sarah told the memorial crowd. Every case I solve is a way of continuing his work. As the sun began to set over Coral Bay, the crowd moved closer to the water's edge. Children carried flowers and notes written to Mallory and Phoenix. Families brought photos of loved ones who had gotten sick from the contaminated water but had recovered after the cleanup. Betty Hollowfield, despite her age, insisted on reading the final tribute. She stood at the water's edge, with tears in her eyes, holding a copy of Mallory's journal. These words were found in Mallory's belongings, Betty said in a strong, clear voice. She wrote them during her last week in Coral Bay, not knowing that someday they would inspire thousands of people. Betty opened the journal to a page marked with a blue ribbon and read, "The ocean doesn't lie. It shows us the truth about what we've done to our world. Phoenix and I came here to find evidence, but we found something more important. We found people worth fighting for. If something happens to us, I hope someone else will continue our work. The water is calling us home, but the truth will live forever. As Betty finished reading, people began releasing their flowers into the clear water. White roses floated out toward the horizon, carried by gentle waves that sparkled in the dying sunlight. Detective Foxworth released 2 flowers, one for each agent. As she watched them drift away, she thought about all the lives that had been saved because of their courage. Clean water flowed through dozens of communities that had been contaminated for decades. Corporate criminals were in prison. Environmental laws had been strengthened across the country. "Thank you," she whispered to the ocean. "Your sacrifice changed everything." A young girl standing nearby tugged on her mother's dress and pointed toward the water. "Mommy, look! The dolphins are swimming around the flowers." Everyone turned to see a pod of dolphins playing in the waves where the memorial flowers floated. The beautiful creatures jumped and splashed, almost like they were celebrating the return of clean water to their home. In that magical moment, as dolphins danced in the clear blue waters of Coral Bay, it was impossible not to believe that Mallory Chen and Phoenix Rodriguez were finally at peace. Their love story had ended in tragedy, but their legacy would live forever in every child who could now swim safely in the bay they died to protect. The memorial service ended with everyone standing in silence, watching the dolphins play as stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The ocean that had once hidden terrible secrets now reflected the light of hope and healing. And somewhere in that peaceful silence, carried on the gentle evening breeze, visitors could almost hear the voices of 2 young heroes whispering across the water. The truth always finds a way to surface, just like the tide. That's the incredible true story of how 2 young heroes saved an entire town, even though it cost them everything. Their love and courage changed thousands of lives forever. We'd love to know, where are you listening from today? Drop your city or country in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. When you subscribe, you're helping us spread stories of kindness, courage, and hope to people all around the world. And don't go anywhere yet. Click on the video appearing on your screen right now for another amazing story that will inspire you. Thanks for listening, and remember, sometimes the smallest acts of courage can change everything.